The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration just took the first step towards testing vehicles with female crash test dummies. Hello, and welcome to Auto Be Careful, the place for car safety, news, and information. I'm Gene, and today we're going to talk about what this means, how it could impact you, and when you could start seeing changes. First, a bit of background. Crash test dummies have a long and storied history, from their origins as humans, cadavers, and strangely enough pigs, to the modern crash test dummies we use today. I've already done a full video on this topic, and I'll link that in the description below. But for the majority of the time that crash test dummies have existed, there has been a much greater emphasis on male crash test dummies. In fact, the current female crash test dummies that are in use today are actually just scaled down versions of male crash test dummies. There hasn't been a truly female modern crash test dummy. This is despite the fact that women make up a larger portion of the population than men in the United States. Nearly 51% of the US population are female, with the remaining 49% being male. While social norms may have impacted the number of female drivers in the past, there hasn't been a formal legal restriction on women driving, and women have been driving since the dawn of the automobile. For the first time ever, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, or NHTSA, is taking steps to include a crash test dummy that truly represents a female driver or passenger. This first step is to publish specifications for the dummy that will be used in crash tests. This is important because experts argue that men and women have different physical characteristics, including height, weight, bone density, and muscle mass. They also tend to sit closer to the steering wheel and may be more vulnerable to whiplash. Additionally, women are more likely to be injured in a collision than men. This new crash test dummy not only has a more accurate representation of the female anatomy, it's much more advanced than the current crash test dummy that's used to represent women. That's because while the currently used crash test dummy was developed in the 1990s, it's based on a design that has been in use since 1978, while the new crash test dummy started being used 35 years later in 2013. The new crash test dummy has a more accurate representation of the human skeleton, a more anatomically correct female pelvis and spine, and a more realistic head and neck. The new dummy can be fitted with up to 174 sensors, while the currently used dummy only has the capacity for 63 sensors. It's hard to understate how big of an upgrade this really is. Now, if you've been watching my channel, you know that the Insurance Institute of Highway Safety, or IIHS, has been using the current version of the female crash test dummy in their crash tests since 2022. That means they've been collecting data to study the impact of collisions on the female body for the past 3 years, which is quite a head start. You may have noted that earlier in the video, I mentioned how the NHTSA is taking the first steps towards including a female crash test dummy in their crash tests, but it's going to take a lot longer before the first crash test is completed with this new dummy. The NHTSA estimates that the first test with this new dummy will be completed in 2027 or 2028. That means by the time the NHTSA finally gets around to including this new technology in their crash tests, the IIHS will have been studying the impacts of collisions on women for about 5 years. While it's admirable that NHTSA is finally getting around to studying this, it's a little disappointing that they're starting roughly 5 years behind the IIHS, and very realistically, roughly 3 decades behind the development of the first female crash test dummy, which was developed in the 1990s. Since the new dummy is much more advanced than the old dummy, you might be thinking it's worth the wait to use the new technology to get the additional data, but that may not be the case. Even though the new dummy has much more advanced technology, it's not really that different in terms of representation. In fact, they basically represent the same person. Both dummies are modeled after what's called a 5th percentile female, which aside from minor changes to height and weight of humans over the past few decades, are pretty much the same. You may know that humans have been getting taller since the 90s, but the average height of a female in 1990 was 5 foot 3.7 inches, and the average height of a female in 2025 is 5 foot 4 inches. With such a minor difference, it's hard to be impressed by this additional representation. While the NHTSA isn't expected to start using this new technology in their tests for a few more years, there's nothing stopping the IIHS from pivoting to it much more quickly. By the time the NHTSA starts using this new crash test dummy, the IIHS will have collected 5 years of crash test data and have the ability to quickly pivot to the new dummy and collect even more. They can then take the data that they've already gathered from the old crash test dummy and compare it to the data they gather from the new crash test dummy and gather even more insight, while the NHTSA is starting from nothing. Actually, worse than that, the NHTSA is starting from nothing in about 2 to 3 years. So why has the NHTSA waited so long to start this process? Your guess is as good as mine. Even with all that, it's wonderful news that we're finally going to collect data on how collisions impact females specifically. It's probably not worth getting too excited though. As I mentioned earlier, both the current and the new crash test dummy represent the same 5th percentile female. If you don't know what that means, it's a woman whose height is about 4 foot 11 inches and weighs about 108 pounds. If you're thinking, that sounds more like a child than a woman, you'd be right. In fact, when highlighting the inclusion of this crash test dummy in their tests, the IIHS specifically called out that it's basically a 2-for-1 deal, quote, representing a small woman or a 12-year-old child, end quote. While it's nice that they're including a dummy that represents a 12-year-old child, it does raise the question, how well does this actually represent women, given how small the dummy is, and that it's actually a scaled down version of the male dummy? Additionally, one thing you may have noticed is I never said this crash test dummy is going to be used to study the effects on a female driver. That's for a couple reasons. First, while the IIHS currently uses the female crash test dummy in their tests, it's positioned in the second row. They actually don't use this dummy in the first row of any of their tests. In fact, they only use this dummy in one of their crash tests. While it's better than nothing, it highlights that there's still a long way to go to have female representation in IIHS crash tests. Obviously, it's a lot better than what's happening at the NHTSA, which has no representation of women in their crash tests. While they're taking steps to correct that, they've provided no details on how many crash tests will include this dummy, which tests those will be, and where the dummy will be positioned in the vehicle when the tests occur. All we know for sure is that the NHTSA has published specifications on a dummy they plan to include in their collection of dummies. Beyond that, nobody knows. So what does this mean for you? Probably not a whole lot at the moment, unless you transport small children in the second row of your vehicle. If you do, be sure to check out my video on the updated 2025 IIHS Top Safety Pick Plus criteria, and then go check out the group of vehicles that made that list. I'll link that video in the description below. For everyone else, we just have to stay excited that there's renewed focus on including more representation in crash testing, and hope that sometime over the next few decades, it actually includes everyone. So that's a look at the NHTSA announcement that they're going to start including more representation in crash testing, who benefits from it, and why it's not as exciting as it sounds. As always, thanks for watching. I hope you learned something, and if you enjoyed this video, be sure to click the like button below and subscribe to see more content like this.